Hello! Welcome to Heavy D Storytelling. We are going to be reading a story, but first up we are going to be doing the Bible verse of the day, and then we're going to be reading the Bible, and then we're going to be doing the synopsis with Kimberly, and then we're going to be reading Around the World in 90 Days. Hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to hit like and subscribe. I said it wrong. Hit the like button, subscribe, hit the bell numbers of the video. I did it slowly, so now I'm going to back. Alright, so we're going to be doing Proverbs 25:17. Hope you guys enjoy. Iron sharpens iron, and one man sharpens another. Little Ninjago action, because iron sharpens iron, steel sharpens steel, and brother sharpens brother. So, hope you guys enjoy. Time for Dad's turn.
Hello! How is everyone doing today? We are all going to sit up and we are going to turn in our Bibles to Romans chapter 10 right after we sit up in our chairs. Great job. Okay, so I'm reading from the English Standard Version. This is Romans chapter 10. Let me begin. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. For I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God, and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness. For God is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. For Moses writes about the righteousness that is based on the law, that the person who does the commandments shall live by them. But the righteousness based on faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven, that is, bring Christ down, or who will descend into the abyss, that is, to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, in your mouth and in your heart, that is, the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved. For the Scripture says, everyone who believes in him will not be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek, for the same Lord is Lord of all, bestowing his riches on all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And how are they to preach unless they are sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. But they have not all obeyed the gospel. For Isaiah says, Lord, who has believed what he has heard from us? So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for their voice has gone out to all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world. But I ask, did Israel not understand? First Moses says, I will make you jealous of those who are not a nation. With a foolish nation I will make you angry. Then Isaiah is so bold as to say, I have been found by those who did not seek me. I have shown myself to those who did not ask for me. But of Israel, he says, all day long I have held out my hands to a disobedient and contrary people. That is the end of chapter 10 of the book of Romans. So tomorrow we will go on with the mystery of salvation in chapter 11. Did I say that was the end of chapter 10? Chapter 10, the end of chapter 10, not 11. All right, so now we are on chapter 21 of Around the World in 80 Days. And so in the last chapter, Fix met Passepartout, and they met in a bar, and Fix drugged him with opium, and he died. And Mr. Fogg, Phileas Fogg, he found out about it, and he was so distraught that he fell off the steamer and drowned to his death. That is the end of the story. Here's Kimberly to say how it really happened.
So, what really happened was Fix told Passepartout about his suspicions of Mr. Fogg, and Passepartout was like, "Dude, you got the wrong guy." And
He said it just like that too.
no, come on. And Fix was not having any of it, so he drugged him until he passed out, and then Mr. Fogg and I almost remember her name. Iota. I knew it sounded somewhat like that. Mr. Fogg and Iota waited until the very last second. Well, not exactly. They found out that the ship had already left because it had left the night before, and Passepartout was going to go tell Mr. Fogg, but Fix didn't let him because of the whole thing that happened. And then they managed to get a different boat going to the same place, I believe. And if they get there on time, then Mr. Fogg is gonna give the guy extra money. I think £200 if they get there on time. Yeah. And then the cat again. And then what happened was they waited till the very last second, hoping that Passepartout would come, but he didn't. So they had to leave without him. I'm going to hand it off to Dad, who's going to read us the story.
Hello, I'm back. I'm also front. I've never told that joke before. All right, so this is chapter 21, in which the master of the Tankadier runs great risk of losing a reward of £200. This voyage of 800 miles was a perilous venture on a craft of 20 tons, and at that season of the year, the Chinese seas are usually boisterous, subject to terrible gales of wind, and especially during the equinoxes, and it was now early November. It would clearly have been to the master's advantage to carry his passengers to Yokohama, since he was paid a certain sum per day, but he would have been rash to attempt such a voyage, and it was imprudent even to attempt to reach Shanghai. But John Bunsby believed in the Tankadier, which rode on the waves like a seagull, and perhaps he was not wrong. Late in the day they passed through the capricious channels of Hong Kong, and the Tankadier, impelled by favorable winds, conducted herself admirably. Excuse me. "I do not need, pilot," said Phileas Fogg when they got into the open sea, "to advise you to use all possible speed. Trust me, your honor. We are carrying all the sail the wind will let us. The poles would add nothing, and are only used when we are going into port. It's your trade, not mine, pilot, and I confide in you." Phileas Fogg, with body erect and legs wide apart, standing like a sailor, gazed without staggering at the swelling waters. The young woman who was seated aft was profoundly affected as she looked out upon the ocean, darkening now with the twilight, on which she had ventured in so frail a vessel. Above her head rustled the white sails, which seemed like great white wings. The boat, carried forward by the wind, seemed to be flying in the air. Night came. The moon was entering her first quarter, and her insufficient light would soon die out in the mist on the horizon. Clouds were rising from the east, and already overcast a part of the heavens. The pilot had hung out his lights, which was very necessary in these seas crowded with vessels bound landward, for collisions are not uncommon occurrences, and at the speed she was going, the least shock would shatter the gallant little craft. Fix, seated in the bow, gave himself up to meditation. He kept apart from his fellow travelers, knowing Mr. Fogg's taciturn tastes. Besides, he did not quite like to talk to a man whose favors he had accepted. He was thinking, too, of the future. It seemed certain that Fogg would not stop at Yokohama, but would at once take the boat for San Francisco, and the vast extent of America would ensure him impunity, and safety. Fogg's plan appeared to him the simplest in the world. Instead of sailing directly from England to the United States like a common villain, he had traversed 3/4 of the globe so as to gain the American continent more surely, and there, after throwing the police off his track, he would quietly enjoy himself with the fortune stolen from the bank. But once in the United States, what should he, Fix, do? Should he abandon this man? No, 100 times no. Until he had secured his extradition, he would not lose sight of him for an hour. It was his duty, and he would fulfill it to the end. At all events, there was one thing to be thankful for. Passepartout was not with his master, and it was above all important. After the confidences Fix had imparted to him, that the servant should never have speech with his master. Phileas Fogg was also thinking of Passepartout, who had so strangely disappeared. Looking at the matter from every point of view, it did not seem to him impossible that, by some mistake, the man might have embarked on the Carnatic at the last moment, and this was also Aouda's opinion, who regretted very much the loss of the worthy fellow to whom she owed so much. They might then find him at Yokohama, for if the Carnatic was carrying him thither, it would be easy to ascertain if he had been on board. A brisk breeze arose about 10 o'clock, but though it might have been prudent to take in a reef, the pilot, after carefully examining the heavens, let the craft remain rigged as before. The Tankadere bore sail admirably, as she drew a great deal of water, and everything was prepared for high speed in case of a gale. Mr. Fogg and Aouda descended into the cabin at midnight, having been already preceded by Fix, who had lain down on one of the cots. The pilot and crew remained on deck all night. At sunrise the next day, which was 8th of November, the boat had made more than 100 miles. The log indicated a mean speed of between 8 and 9 miles. The Tankadere still carried all sail, and was accomplishing her greatest capacity of speed. If the wind held as it was, the chances would be in her favor. During the day she kept along the coast where the currents were favorable. The coast, irregular in profile, and visible sometimes across the clearings, was at most 5 miles distant. The sea was less boisterous, since the wind came off land, a fortunate circumstance for the boat, which would suffer, owing to its small tonnage, by a heavy surge on the sea. The breeze subsided a little toward noon, and set in from the southwest. The pilot put up his poles, but took them down again within 2 hours, as the wind freshened up anew. Mr. Fogg and Aouda, happily unaffected by the roughness of the sea, ate with a good appetite, Fix being invited to share their repas, which he accepted with secret chagrin. To travel at this man's expense and live upon his provisions was not palatable to him. Still he was obliged to eat, and so he ate. When the meal was over, he took Mr. Fogg apart and said, "Sir." This "sir" scorched his lips, and he had to control himself to avoid collaring this gentleman. "Sir, you have been very kind to give me a passage on this boat, but though my means will not admit of my expending them as freely as you, I must ask to pay my share." "Let us not speak of that, sir," replied Mr. Fogg. "But if I insist—" "No, sir," repeated Mr. Fogg, in a tone which did not admit of reply. "This enters into my general expenses." Fix, as he bowed, had a stifled feeling, and, going forward, where he ensconced himself, did not open his mouth for the rest of the day. Meanwhile they were progressing famously, and John Bunsby was in high hope. He several times assured Mr. Fogg that he would reach Shanghai in time, to which that gentleman responded that he counted upon it. The crew set to work in good earnest, inspired by the reward to be gained. There was not a sheet which was not tightened, not a sail which was not vigorously hoisted, not a lurch could be charged to the man at the helm. They worked as desperately as if they were contesting in a royal yacht regatta. But by evening the logs showed that 220 miles had been accomplished from Hong Kong, and Mr. Fogg might hope that he would be able to reach Yokohama without recording any delay in his journal, in which case the many misadventures which had overtaken him since he left London would not seriously affect his journey. The Tankadere entered the Straits of Fokien, which separate the island of Formosa from the Chinese coast, in the small hours of the night, and crossed the Tropic of Cancer. The sea was very rough in the straits, full of eddies formed by the countercurrents, and the chopping waves broke her course, whilst it became very difficult to stand on deck. At daybreak, the wind began to blow hard again, and the heavens seemed to predict a gale. The barometer announced a speedy change, the mercury rising and falling capriciously. The sea also in the southeast raised long surges which indicated a tempest. The sun had set the evening before in a red mist in the midst of the phosphorescent scintillations of the ocean. John Bunsby long examined the threatening aspect of the heavens, muttering indistinctly between his teeth. At last he said in a low voice to Mr. Fogg, "Shall I speak out to your honor?" "Of course." "Well, we are going to have a squall." "Is the wind north or south?" asked Mr. Fogg quietly. "South. Look, a typhoon is coming." "Glad it's a typhoon from the south, for it will carry us forward." "Oh, if you take it that way," said John Bunsby, "I've nothing more to say." John Bunsby's suspicions were confirmed. At a less advanced season of the year, the typhoon, according to a famous meteorologist, would have passed away like a luminous cascade of electric flame, but in the winter equinox it was to be feared that it would burst upon them with great violence. The pilot took his precautions in advance. He reefed all sail, the pole masts were dispensed with, all hands went forward to the bows. A single triangle sail of strong canvas was hoisted as a storm jib so as to hold the wind from behind. Then they waited. John Bunsby had requested his passengers to go below, but this imprisonment in so narrow a space, with little air and the boat bouncing in the gale, was far from pleasant. Neither Mr. Fogg, Fix, nor Iota consented to leave the deck. The storm of rain and wind descended upon them toward 8 o'clock, but with its bit of sail the Tankadere was lifted like a feather by a wind, an idea of whose violence can scarcely be given. To compare her speed to 4 times that of a locomotive going on full steam would be below the truth. The boat scudded thus northward during the whole day, borne on by monstrous waves, preserving always, fortunately, a speed equal to theirs. 20 times she seemed almost to be submerged by these mountains of water which rose behind her, but the adroit management of the pilot saved her. The passengers were often bathed in spray, but they submitted to it philosophically. Fix cursed it, no doubt, but Iota, with her eyes fastened upon her protector, whose coolness amazed her, showed herself worthy of him, and bravely weathered the storm. As for Phileas Fogg, it seemed just as if the typhoon were a part of his program. Up to this time the Tankadere had always held her course to the north, but toward evening the wind, veering 3 quarters, bore down from the northwest. The boat, now lying in the trough of the waves, shook and rolled terribly. The sea struck her with fearful violence. At night the tempest increased in violence. John Bunsby saw the approach of darkness and the rising of the storm with dark misgivings. He thought a while, and then asked his crew if it was not time to slacken speed. After a consultation, he approached Mr. Fogg and said, "I think, your honor, that we should do well to make for one of the ports on the coast." "I think so too." "Ah," said the pilot, "but which one?" "I know of but one," returned Mr. Fogg tranquilly, "and that is Shanghai." The pilot at first did not seem to comprehend. He could scarcely realize so much determination and tenacity. Then he cried, well, yes, your honor is right, to Shanghai." So the Tankadeer kept steadily on her northward track. The night was really terrible. It would be a miracle if the craft did not founder. Twice it could have been all over with her if the crew had not been constantly on the watch. Aouda was exhausted, but did not utter a complaint. More than once Mr. Fogg rushed to protect her from the violence of the waves. Day reappeared. The tempest still raged with undiminished fury, but the wind now returned to the southeast. It was a favorable change, and the Tankadeer again bounded forward on this mountainous sea, though the waves crossed each other and imparted shocks and countershocks which would have crushed a craft less solidly built. From time to time the coast was visible through the broken mist, but no vessel was in sight. The Tankadeer was alone upon the sea. There were some signs of a calm at noon, and these became more distinct as the sun descended toward the horizon. The tempest had been as brief as terrific. The passengers, thoroughly exhausted, could now eat a little and take some repose. The night was comparatively quiet. Some of the sails were again hoisted, and the speed of the boat was very good. The next morning at dawn they espied the coast, and John Bunsby was able to assert that they were not 100 miles from Shanghai, 100 miles in only one day to traverse them. That very evening Mr. Fogg was due at Shanghai if he did not wish to miss the steamer to Yokohama. Had there been no storm during which several hours were lost, they would be at this moment within 30 miles of their destination. The wind grew decidedly calmer, and happily the sea fell with it. All sails were now hoisted, and at noon the Tankadeer was within 45 miles of Shanghai. There remained yet 6 hours in which to accomplish that distance. All on board feared that it could not be done, and every one, Phileas Fogg no doubt excepted, felt his heart beat with impatience. The boat must keep up an average of 9 miles an hour, and the wind was becoming calmer every moment. It was a capricious breeze coming from the coast, and after it passed the sea became smooth. Still the Tankadeer was so light, and her fine sails caught the fickle zephyrs so well that with the aid of the currents John Bunsby found himself at 6 o'clock not more than 10 miles from the mouth of the Shanghai River. Shanghai itself is situated at least 12 miles up the stream. At 7 they were still 3 miles from Shanghai. The pilot swore an angry oath. The reward of £200 was evidently on the point of escaping him. He looked at Mr. Fogg. Mr. Fogg was perfectly tranquil, and yet his whole fortune was at this moment at stake. At this moment also a long black funnel, crowned with wreaths of smoke, appeared on the edge of the waters. It was the American steamer leaving for Yokohama at the appointed time. "Confound her!" cried John Bunsby, pushing back the rudder with a desperate jerk. "Signal her," said Phileas Fogg quietly. A small brass cannon stood on the forward deck of the Tankadeer for making signals in the fogs. It was loaded to the muzzle, but just as the pilot was about to apply a red-hot coal to the touch-hole, Mr. Fogg said, "Hoist your flag." The flag was run up at half-mast, and this being the signal of distress, it was hoped that the American steamer, perceiving it, would change her course a little so as to succor the pilot boat. "Fire!" said Mr. Fogg, and the booming of the little cannon resounded in the air. Chapter 22, in which Passepartout finds out that, even at the antipodes, it is convenient to have some money in one's pocket. The Carnatic, setting sail from Hong Kong at 6:30 on the 7th of November, directed her course at full steam toward Japan. She carried a large cargo and a well-filled cabin of passengers. 2 staterooms in the rear were, however, unoccupied, those which had been engaged by Phileas Fogg. The next day, a passenger with a half-stupefied eye, staggering gait, and disordered hair was seen to emerge from the second cabin and to totter to a seat on deck. It was Passepartout, and what had happened to him was as follows. Shortly after Fix left the opium den, 2 waiters had lifted the unconscious Passepartout and had carried him to the bed reserved for the smokers. 3 hours later, pursued even in his dreams by a fixed idea, the poor fellow awoke and struggled against the stupefying influence of the narcotic. The thought of a duty unfulfilled shook off his torpor, and he hurried from the abode of drunkenness, staggering and holding himself up by keeping against the walls, falling down and creeping up again, and irresistibly impelled by a kind of instinct, he kept crying out, "The Carnatic! The Carnatic!" The steamer lay puffing along the quay on the point of starting. Passepartout had but few steps to go, and rushing upon the plank, he crossed it and fell unconscious on the deck, just as the Carnatic was moving off. Several sailors, who were evidently accustomed to this sort of scene, carried the poor Frenchman down into the second cabin, and Passepartout did not wake until they were 150 miles away from China. Thus he found himself the next morning on the deck of the Carnatic, and eagerly inhaling the exhilarating sea breeze. The pure air sobered him. He began to collect his sense, which he found a difficult task, but at last he recalled the events of the evening before, Fix's revelation, and the opium house. "It is evident," said he to himself, "that I have been abominably drunk. What will Mr. Fogg say? At least I have not missed the steamer, which is the most important thing." Then, as Fix occurred to him, "As for that rascal, I hope we are well rid of him, and that he has not dared, as he proposed, to follow us on board the Carnatic. A detective on the track of Mr. Fogg, accused of robbing the Bank of England? Pshaw! Mr. Fogg is no more a robber than I am a murderer." Should he divulge Fix's real errand to his master? Would it do to tell the part of the detective was playing? Would it not be better to wait until Mr. Fogg reached London again, and then impart to him that an agent of the Metropolitan Police had been following him round the world, and have a good laugh over it? No doubt, at least, it was worth considering. The first thing to do was to find Mr. Fogg and apologize for his singular behavior. Passepartout got up and proceeded, as well as he could, with the rolling of the steamer to the after-deck. He saw no one who resembled either his master or Aouda. "Good," muttered he. "Aouda has not got up yet, and Mr. Fogg has probably found some partners at whist." He descended to the salon. Mr. Fogg was not there. Passepartout had only, however, to ask the pursuer the number of his master's stateroom. The pursuer replied that he did not know any passenger by the name of Fogg. "I beg your pardon," said Passepartout persistently. "He is a tall gentleman, quiet and not very talkative, and has with him a young lady." "Excuse me." "There is no young lady on board," interrupted the purser. "Here is a list of the passengers. You may see for yourself." Passepartout scanned the list, but his master's name was not upon it. All at once an idea struck him. "Ah, am I on the Carnatic?" "Yes." "On the way to Yokohama?" "Certainly." Passepartout had for an instant feared that he was on the wrong boat, but though he was really on the Carnatic, his master was not there. He fell thunderstruck on a seat. He saw it all now. He remembered that the time of sailing had been changed, that he should have informed his master of that fact, and that he had not done so. It was his fault, then, that Mr. Fogg and Aouda had missed the steamer. Yes, but it was still more the fault of the traitor, who, in order to separate him from his master and detain the latter at Hong Kong, had inveigled him into getting drunk. He now saw the detective's trick, and at this moment Mr. Fogg was certainly ruined. His bet was lost, and he himself perhaps arrested and imprisoned. At this thought, Passepartout tore his hair. Ah, if Fix had come within his reach, what a settling of accounts there would be. After his first depression, Passepartout became calmer and began to study his situation. It was certainly not an enviable one. He found himself on the way to Japan, and what should he do when he got there? His pocket was empty. He had not a solitary shilling, not so much as a penny. His passage had fortunately been paid for in advance, and he had 5 or 6 days in which to decide upon his future course. He fell to at meals with an appetite, and ate for Mr. Fogg, Aouda, and himself. He helped himself as generously as if Japan were a dessert, where nothing to eat was to be looked for. At dawn on the 13th, the Carnatic entered the port of Yokohama. This is an important port of call in the Pacific, where all the mail steamers and those carrying travelers between North America, China, Japan, and the Oriental Islands put in. It is situated in the Bay of Yedo, and at but a short distance from the second capital of the Japanese Empire, and the residence of the Tycoon, the civil emperor, before the Mikado, the spiritual emperor, absorbed his office in his own. The Carnatic anchored at the quay near the custom house in the midst of a crowd of ships bearing the flags of all nations. Passepartout went timidly ashore on this so curious territory of the sons of the sun. He had nothing better to do than, taking chance for his guide, to wander aimlessly through the streets of Yokohama. He found himself at first in a thoroughly European quarter. Sorry, I got something in my throat tonight. The houses having low fronts and being adorned with verandas, beneath which he caught glimpses of neat peristyles. The quarter occupied, with its streets, squares, docks, and warehouses, all the spaces between the promontory of the treaty and the river. Here, as at Hong Kong and Calcutta, were mixed crowds of all races, Americans and English, Chinamen and Dutchmen, mostly merchants ready to buy or sell anything. The Frenchman felt himself as much alone among them as if he had dropped down in the midst of the Hottentots. He had at least one resource, to call on the French and English consuls at Yokohama for assistance, but he shrank from telling the story of his adventures, intimately connected as it was with that of his master, and before doing so he determined to exhaust all other means of aid. As chance did not favor him in the European quarter, he penetrated that inhabited by the native Japanese, determined, if necessary, to push on to Yedo. The Japanese quarter of Yokohama is called Benten, after the goddess of the sea, who is worshipped on the islands round about. There Passepartout beheld beautiful fir and cedar groves, sacred gates of a singular architecture, bridges half hid in the midst of bamboos, and reeds, temples shaded by immense cedar trees, holy retreats where were sheltered Buddhist priests and sectaries of Confucius, and interminable streets where a perfect harvest of rose-tinted and red-cheeked children who looked as if they had been cut out of Japanese screens, and who were playing in the midst of short-legged poodles and yellowish cats, might have been gathered. The streets were crowded with people. Priests were passing in processions, beating their dreary tambourines. Police and custom-house officers with pointed hats encrusted with lac and carrying 2 sabers hung to their waists. Soldiers clad in blue cotton with white stripes and bearing guns. The Mikado's guards enveloped in silken doublets, hauberks, and coats of mail, and numbers of military folk of all ranks, for the military profession is as much respected in Japan as it is despised in China, went hither and thither in groups and pairs. Passepartout saw 2 begging friars, long-robed pilgrims, and simple civilians with their warped and jet-black hair, big heads, long busts, slender legs, short stature, and complexions varying from copper color to a dead white, but never yellow like the Chinese, from whom the Japanese widely differ. He did not fail to observe the curious equipages, carriages and palanquins, barrows supplied with sails, and litters made of bamboo, nor the women, whom he thought not especially handsome, who took little steps with their little feet, whereon they wore canvas shoes, straw sandals, and clogs of worked wood, and who displayed tight-looking eyes, flat chests, teeth fashionably blackened, and gowns crossed with silken scarves tied in an enormous knot behind an ornament which the modern Parisian ladies seem to have borrowed from the dames of Japan. Passepartout wandered for several hours in the midst of this motley crowd, looking in at the windows of the rich and curious shops, the jewelry establishments glittering with quaint Japanese ornaments, the restaurants decked with streamers and banners, the tea houses where the odorous beverage was being drunk with sake, a liquor concocted from the fermentation of rice, and the comfortable smoking houses where they were puffing not opium, which is almost unknown in Japan, but a very fine, stringy tobacco. He went on till he found himself in the fields in the midst of the vast rice plantations. There he saw dazzling camellias expanding themselves with flowers which were giving forth their last colors and perfumes, not on bushes, but on trees, and within bamboo enclosures, cherry, plum, and apple trees, which the Japanese cultivate rather for their blossoms than their fruit, and which queerly fashioned, grinning scarecrows protected from the sparrows, pigeons, ravens, and other voracious birds. On the branches of the cedars were perched large eagles. Amid the foliage of the weeping willows were herons solemnly standing on one leg, and on every hand were crows, ducks, hawks, wild birds, and a multitude of cranes which the Japanese consider sacred, and which to their minds symbolize long life and prosperity. As he was strolling along, Passepartout espied some violets among the shrubs. "Good," said he, "I'll have some supper." But on smelling them he found that they were odorless. "No chance there," thought he. The worthy fellow had certainly taken good care to eat as hearty a breakfast as possible before leaving the Carnatic, but as he had been walking about all day, the demands of hunger were becoming importunate. He observed that the butcher's stalls contained neither mutton, goat, nor pork, and knowing also that it is a sacrilege to kill cattle, which are preserved solely for farming, he made up his mind that meat was far from plentiful in Yokohama. Nor was he mistaken, and in default of butcher's meat, he could have wished for a quarter of a wild boar or deer, a partridge, or some quails, some game or fish, which, with rice, the Japanese eat almost exclusively. But he found it necessary to keep up a stout heart, and to postpone the meal he craved till the following morning. Night came, and Passepartout re-entered the native quarter, where he wandered through the streets, lit by vari-colored lanterns, looking on at the dancers who were executing skilful steps and boundings, and the astrologers who stood in the open air with their telescopes. Then he came to the harbor, which was lit by the resin torches of the fishermen who were fishing from their boats. The streets at last became quiet, and the officers of which, in their splendid costumes and surrounded by their suites, Passepartout thought seemed like ambassadors, succeeded the bustling crowd. Each time a company passed, Passepartout chuckled and said to himself, "Good, another Japanese embassy departing for Europe." And that is the end of chapter 22. Next time we will read chapter 23, in which Passepartout's nose becomes outrageously long. And the first word is the. And I hope that you are enjoying this story. And we have just, I believe, 6 more installments left before we finish the story. And I'm not sure how many chapters. I will figure that one out. And God bless you. And it looks like we've got a ribbon train. Here comes Kimberly.
Which chapter was it again?
So I'm doing a friendship bracelet. This is what it looks like so far. I made this up all on my own, the pattern, and it's the first time I did it, so it might have a few holes in it. I'll get it better though. I hope you guys are having a good day, and I hope that you I hope you have a good day tomorrow. Bye.